Afternoon. My name is James Green. I'm a professor of history here, and I direct the public history track. And delighted to welcome all of you to the campus of the University of Massachusetts at Boston, one which we share with many wonderful neighbors, including the Massachusetts Archives and the Commonwealth Museum, whose courtesy we very much appreciate for using this wonderful space. You also know, of course, about the Kennedy Library next door and soon under construction right near us here at the Edward M. Kennedy's Center for the Study of the United States Senate. So it's great to have so many other government workers here like ourselves, federal employees, people who work in public history in the public sector. I also wanted to tell you that we have a little, if you're interested in our graduate track in public history and archives, we have a nice little brochure in back here. And we have a number of our students here helping us today. If you could just stand up, the students who are in the room. So yeah, they're all working. They're in back. There they are. And I don't want to embarrass her, but Tara Mays, who's sitting at the table back here, was at the park break. She was one of the participants in the park break, so we're very excited about that. So we're convening a conversation this afternoon about a recent publication constructed by four historians under the auspices of the Organization of American Historians, entitled The Imperiled Promise, The State of History in the National Park Service. And we're very pleased to have one of those four historians, authors of the report here today, Marla Miller, from our colleague from UMass Amherst in back. So good to see you, Marla. I hope she'll contribute to the conversation. We want to thank many people, particularly Boston National Historical Park and Superintendent Cassius Cash, whom I will introduce in a moment, for acknowledging what is an important topic in the spirit of promoting dialogue and further action by recording it. And by the way, this will be recorded on film by our folks here from UMass Boston, again with the support of Superintendent Cash. We thank him for that so that other people will be able to view this visually. So just to note, if you are curious to read more of the report or haven't seen it yet, you can look at the Boston National Historical Park website, nps.gov/BOST, or the website of the Organization of American Historians, OAH.org. So at this point, I'll ask you all to turn off your cell phones and your beepers. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold. Also, let you know that right here outside this door, I'm pointing in this direction, are the restrooms. The format will be that we will have two roundtable discussions focused on the larger concerns the report raises. And then each speaker will have about 5 minutes for remarks with time for audience participation. So we're asking the panelists to speak real clearly into the microphone, and I will bring this one back to the table in a minute so that we can capture your words for the recording. There'll be a short 15-minute break between the panels, and at the conclusion, we will adjourn, invite you all to a reception with some food and drink sponsored by the UMass Public History Program and Dean Jha of the College of Graduate Studies here at UMass Boston. So to join me in welcoming you, I'd like to introduce now Cassius Cash, the superintendent of the Boston National Historic Park and the Boston African American National Historic Site. Many of us know that the Freedom Trail has told the story of America's struggle for liberty. More than 3 million people walk the trail each year, visiting such sites as Faneuil Hall, Old South Meeting House, Old State House, etc. Superintendent Cash saw this history with fresh eyes by finding a new way to interpret it for the 21st century, rebranding this space Boston's Trails to Freedom, encompassing the Black Heritage Trail and the Freedom Trail. So with our thanks, I'm happy to introduce Superintendent Cash.
Wow, what a turnout. I knew that we would have some folks to come, but I got to say I'm really impressed with the turnout today, particularly with us all experiencing somewhat of an unusual week, to say the least. So with that, I'd like to keep our co-workers in mind that's down in New York that's wish they could be here with us. And so as we go through today and talk about and participate in a very stimulating conversation, Park Service employees, please keep our fellow brothers and sisters in mind as they continue to do their cleanup down in New York. I got to say I'm very pleased for the National Park Service to be partnering with the National History Program here at UMass. For the NPS to be successful, it's very clear to us that we're going to have to reach out to various organizations. And our local and national and regional leadership fully understands that in order to enrich and deepen this local history that we share with visitors, specifically partnering with universities as we have done this is pretty much essential, as the report has shared with us if you've had a chance to look over it yet. It is also great to see National Park Service employees at the regional park and Washington office level participate as panelists. In order to see dramatic improvement, we're clear and understand that it's going to have change at each one of those levels in the organization. Too often, us in the Park Service, as I'm learning, I've only been in 3 years, but it's clear that in the Park Service, we sometimes can view history as an unchanging true story rather than an ongoing discovery process, as the report indicates, in which narratives and interpretations change over time. And I'm going to go off script and say change over time, but as we'll learn it must change over time. It's no longer, when you look at the folks that are visiting our parks today, it's something that must happen. And so that's what makes today such a relevant and timely discussion to have here. This report is, if you've read it, it's definitely a wake-up call. I had a chance to read the summary yesterday and some through the report, and it was definitely a wake-up call to me on things that we need to do and the challenges that awaits us in the future here. We're asked to embrace innovation, have sensitivity for subject matter, even embrace controversial subjects. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. Engage with our visitors in shaping programs and stimulate dialogue. It's a tall order, but as we confront our agency's centennial and look to find our place in its future, I would say we're up for this challenge, and I know you guys are too. We can take this report to heart and empower our staff, our colleagues, visitors, and partners to become informed and engaged citizens. So for those that are visiting us here today in Boston, I would like to also, on behalf of National Park Service, welcome you here, and I'm looking forward to a very engaging and stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Cash. So now let me turn to the first panel and introduce the person who will chair it, who's also one of the organizing committee members for this, including my colleague Jane Becker. Is Jane here? She's back. Thanks, Jane, and Marty Blatt. Louis Hutchin worked for the NPS for 17 years before deciding to make a career change and returned to teaching history at the high school level. With the NPS, he served as historian for Boston National Historical Park, curator for the Northeast Museum Services Center, and finally, as the chief historian in the Northeast Regional Office. He is currently enrolled in the graduate program at the Education School here at UMass Boston. So, Louis.
Thank you, Jim. I have to say it's really, this is a wonderful transition for me because of course, my career has been with the Park Service for 17 years, and then to be able to have the opportunity to come to UMass as a student and still participate in the Park Service is really a nice blending for me. So I want to thank my panel members, first of all, for making time in their schedule to contribute to this important conversation for the National Park Service. Unfortunately, Barb Polverine, the Chief of Interpretation, Education, and Partnerships in the Northeast region, is not able to join us today because of the after effects of the hurricane. She sends her regrets, and I know she is a huge supporter of this report and will be an important leader going forward in implementing the recommendations that we generate as well as the recommendations in the report. She was actually originally scheduled to come up to Boston earlier in the week. Her plane was canceled, and she couldn't get on another plane to come up. But fortunately for us, Inez Wallens has stepped in. She's the Chief of Interpretation and Education for Boston National Historical Park, and she's agreed to participate on our panel. I'll introduce her and the others momentarily. So this is how I'd like to see this session over the next hour and a half work. Given that each speaker will make a 5-minute introductory remarks, I will introduce the speakers up front, and after the panelists speak, I will open it to the audience to comment directly on the sections in the report that we are addressing, as well as to comment on the opening remarks of the speakers. The idea is really to create a back and forth conversation, not just back and forth audience panelists, but amongst everybody. And we also have a larger objective in mind for this panel and for the one that follows. The ultimate outcome of this conversation is to consider and generate a specific list of attainable recommendations or action items, as we like to call them in the Park Service, for the Northeast region to begin to implement. At the end of the two roundtable presentations, we would like collectively to develop a list of priority recommendations to address the key aspects of the report. Now, as you know, this first session is focusing on the divide between history and interpretation. In fact, it's finding number 1. And then the role that partnerships, that is to say academic, community, and other cultural institutions can play in bridging this divide, finding number 7. So in the report, the authors identified the history-interpretation divide as perhaps the most significant history challenge facing the Park Service today. And the implications of this divide run throughout the report. So to just quote from the introductory section on finding 1, it says, "The intellectually artificial, yet bureaucratically real divide between history and interpretation constrains NPS historians, compromises history practice in the agency, and hobbles effective history interpretation. The NPS should find and take every opportunity to reintegrate professional history practice and interpretation." So if I could sort of summarize the findings around this topic, it would be that on the one hand, trained historians within the agency are, as one respondent put it, relegated to the Section 106 ghetto, which is to say they're involved primarily with cultural resource management and compliance issues, while those interpreting are not supported in the learning of the history, and those caring for the resources are not trained in important interpretive messages. So how does this divide play out in the parks, in the region, and service-wide? And how can we address this concern that will be touched on by our speakers today? So now to introduce the speakers. The first speaker will be Inez Wallens. And as I said earlier, she's the Chief of Interpretation and Education for Boston National Historical Park. Before coming to the Park Service 2 years ago, was it? 2 years ago. She was Senior Director of Education and Visitor Experience at the Autry National Center of the American West in Los Angeles, where she worked with curators, educators, and designers to plan, implement, and evaluate the educational programs in media. She created courses and symposia and led visitor studies. Now that's a thought, the Park Service. Led visitor studies to measure the impact of exhibitions and educational programs. She also initiated collaborations with universities, cultural organizations, and other educational partners. She began her museum education career at the Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell University. She's also worked at the Tampa Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and then served as executive director of the Wichita Art Museum in Kansas, and the Harn Museum of Art in Florida, and the C.M. Russell Museum in Montana. And she's at least 75 years old then. Inez has held joint appointments in graduate programs in museum education at the University of South Florida, Pratt Institute, and the Bank Street College of Education in Manhattan. Our second speaker will be Chris Gwynn. And Chris writes, after graduating from Gettysburg College with a BA in History and Shippensburg State University of Pennsylvania with a Master's in Applied History, Chris Gwynn joined the NPS serving as Interpretive Park Ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park, Antietam National Battlefield, Boston National Historical Park, and the National Mall and Memorial Parks. At the National Mall, he developed some of the first interpretive programs at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. Chris is now an interpretive ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park. Our third speaker is Frank Barrows, who is the Chief of Interpretation and Education at New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. He's a 12-year veteran with the National Park Service, and all of those years have been in the field of interpretation and education. He has served in various roles at New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park, including youth programs coordinator, volunteer coordinator, and web and publications coordinator. Frank was the recipient of the 2010 Northeast Region Freeman Tilden Award for establishing the Youth Ambassador Program through music, video, art, and social media outreach. He was also the project manager for the park's newly installed Communities of Whaling exhibit, an exhibit that interprets the stories of 5 ethnic groups: African Americans, Cape Verdeans, Azorians, Native Americans, and West Indians, and their connections to New Bedford's whaling history. And our last speaker is Luann Jones. Luann Jones joined the National Park Service History Program in Washington, D.C., as a staff historian in January 2009. Drawing on 25 years of oral history experience in public history and academic settings, Luann has led efforts to improve oral history practice in the National Park Service. In 2010, she initiated the Effective Oral History course, which has been offered at 3 locations and trained over 70 NPS personnel. Before joining the National Park Service, Luann was an associate professor at the University of South Florida and East Carolina University. Between 1986 and 1991, she directed an oral history of Southern agriculture at the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian Institution, and she's the author of Mama Learned Us to Work, Farm Women in the New South, and co-author of Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World in 1987 and 2002. So, Inez, if I could turn it over to you, and I'm going to actually ask the speakers for their opening remarks to come up so that everybody can see the people clearly.
Good afternoon. I'm having kind of a Clint Eastwood moment, if you will. Because if you're watching on film, you're probably expecting Barb Pollerine to be here. So I'm imagining her in some empty chair, kind of cheering me on and giving me specific talking points. So I'm going to kind of weave mine with hers. So if you agree with everything, it's probably Barb's. If you disagree, I'll own it. On one of my first days at Boston National Historical Park, I met Dr. Marty Blatt. Don't know if you know him. He's sitting on the first row. And I was kind of nuts. I extended my hand and said, "Hi, I imagine my closest working relationship in this park is going to be with you." He probably thought I was kind of nuts. But I have to say that I actually really meant it. Having come from the museum world and from an organization that really values curator-educator partnerships, or in our case, historian-interpreter partnerships, we knew that we were going to work hard to make this work. I have to say, given everything on our plates, it's sheer will and determination that causes that. So I want to quickly just jump to the NPS issue of the divide. I think we in the Park Service created this divide or this silo, and I will start by saying we're the ones who can change it. For example, our chief historian, whether he likes it or not, actively participates and promulgates some of our division's continuing education programs. He often facilitates them. He reviews and contributes to our work on a daily basis, from looking at our program outlines, to waysides, to e-newsletters, to web essays, challenging our sources, challenging our content, questioning our assumptions, sending us back to the drawing board, and making us stronger and better at what we do. For that, first of all, I say thank you to you. But frankly, I wouldn't have it any other way. I think that's the way we should be working. Whether you have a historian on staff at your park, or whether you work with university faculty, and frankly, we should be doing both, it starts by embracing and valuing the very different but important canons that each of us bring to the relationship. Yes, sometimes it's really sticky, but that's how we learn and that's how we grow. My second point, I think that field rangers who rotate daily, every 50 minutes or every hour among duty stations, and supervisors and chiefs who I have to say are mired in paperwork, a new thing that I've learned since coming to the Park Service, have very little time, and Barb has agreed with this one, they have very little time on any given day to actually do any concerted efforts in terms of content, exploring and learning new delivery systems, adapting to new national educational standards, or engaging in any kind of dialogue with our communities about these topics. So I ask those of you who are Interp Rangers in the audience, and I know the Boston team is here and they can raise their hand to this one, to raise your hand if you spent part of any given day counting change in a cash drawer, or collecting money out of a donation box, or changing toilet paper at your museums or your parks visitor centers. So my point is, just like historians, we too, as interpreters, are challenged every day to think strategically about ways that we can solve our operational challenges and issues and needs so that we can spend a much larger percentage of our time doing really good history and doing really quality interpretation. From my perspective, good interpretation is really hard to do, and frankly, it's even harder to find. At many parks, I think we still see talking at people versus talking with people. Fact-based programs, large chronological lists of dates, without interpretive themes, a string of facts with no real connection to an actual site, without strong introductions, with really weak or no conclusions. I think that's our real challenge as interpreters, and until and unless we do that, we're in big trouble. We really have to work harder at providing multiple perspectives, at introducing new scholarship, and we spent a lot of time talking about that at Park Break just a week or two ago, at questioning our older premises and sharing meaning by creating substantial conversations with visitors, creating interactivity and exchanges that truly resonate with visitors. I think that sometimes those conversations are often about messy or controversial topics, but that's also thought-provoking and relevant to visitors' lives today. With so little time to really do history or historical thinking, I think it's far too easy to get caught in that trap with all the bureaucracy, and it doesn't matter if you're in academia or in the Park Service, we all have it in our lives. So I think the key is to make sure that you keep in mind that that's the other stuff, and it takes away from the really important work that we do. And so we have to change the picture entirely and look at the big picture. I think that historians and educators are more like two peas in the same pod. I think there's strength in numbers, and I think we need to become change agents. In Boston, we're trying to do that by changing our core structure completely so that career seasonal visitor services assistants will work with interns and volunteers to address excellent customer service, from orientation to wayfinding to ticketing and logistics, all of which are necessary to provide really positive and satisfying visitor experiences, and also then allowing our park guides and rangers to work together with their real work of developing, conducting, and evaluating programs, events, talks, tours, building partnerships, and expanding the menu of learning opportunities that our visitors will find. My third point, a key to both closing the divide, and I borrowed this one from Barb, and working across disciplines is to acknowledge not that we partner, but that we have to partner in order to reach new audiences, build new ideas, challenge assumptions, and foster new scholarship. We need to find ways to work with partners, both academic and programmatic, to use social media and new technologies every chance we can, and more importantly, to engage the public, who are both our owners and our users. Sometimes differing organizational cultures are in conflict, and we know that, but they can and should be overcome to produce amazing results. Some of my colleagues in the audience from the USS Constitution Museum can probably attest to the fact that together over the past year, we've created some really amazing products and services that no one entity probably would have been able to do on its own, but we're better because of it. So I have to say, it can be done. And finally, and to challenge a point that was made in the Imperiled Promise, I have to take issue probably with the most significant and biggest challenge that today faces the Park Service. I'm not so sure it's the history interpretation divide. I think the biggest challenge facing the Park Service is a hiring practice that produces a certificate listing the best and most eligible candidates for a ranger position, where a machine mechanic, she stops to pause for effect, where a machine mechanic is ranked better qualified to be an interpretive park ranger over master's level educators or credentialed historians with years of seasonal work and employment in our very own subject matter. It's just plain wrong. So I think it's unfortunate, but our very real challenge is to figure out creative ways to hire only the best and only the brightest. I mean, yes, we want them to have these credentials. I want fabulous teachers. They are born, they are not made. And so we have to challenge those hiring authorities, rewrite job descriptions, reclassify positions, and figure out ways to be creative around the structure. I'd love to have a Martin Luther King moment and say, I envision a day when it's all going to be great. But you know what? On my Facebook wall this morning, there was a little quote from the Harvard Business Review, and it said something, I'm badly paraphrasing, something like, managers learn to comply with challenges, and leaders learn to change structures. I think all of us in this room need to grow to be leaders and change those structures. I think our parks and our visitors will be better for it.
Well, first off, I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be here today. Again, I'm Christopher Gwynn from Gettysburg National Military Park. I want to thank all of you. I want to thank my colleagues up on the panel, all of whom have much more impressive resumes than I do, and I didn't really realize that until they rattled down the list here. I want to particularly thank Inez. I started out as a permanent in Boston, and when Inez had everybody raise their hands and kind of polling folks as to if they change bathroom stall toilet paper, I used to collect donation money at Boston. And when Inez came, she helped put a stop to that. So, Inez, I want to thank you for that. Thank you, Inez. Folks, here's what I want to do today. And as everyone said, what we're going to look at are two different talking points, two different findings. The history-interp divide and partnerships. And I want to address both of those. And what I want to do is address them from my perspective at kind of the bottom of the totem pole as a GS9 interpretive ranger out there in the field, because I think sometimes the game looks a little bit different from the bleacher seats than it does from up in the luxury box. So that's what I want to talk about. First off, let's start with the history-interp divide. I think there is a divide, and I think it's a sizable one. But I don't think you can look at the Park Service as a whole. I think what you got to do is you got to look at individual parks. You got to look at individual units, individual offices, and you got to see what they're doing. And I think what you'll find is some parks are doing a really good job at bridging that divide. And I think other parks are having a big challenge. And I've worked at a number of different parks, and some of them are doing really well, and some of them are not. For example, where I come from down in Pennsylvania, in Gettysburg, the man I answer to every single day, he's a supervisory historian. And we have another historian, and all they do is all that, section, 106, historic resource report, all that. So the fact that I answer to a historian helps to bridge that divide. Now, I've worked at other parks where they didn't have a historian, period. And that's a problem. It's a problem for field rangers. And, I'll also say that I think if you go out today and you ask most field rangers what the historian at their park does, or what the regional historian does, or what they do down in the Washington office, I think that they won't have a very good answer for you, because I don't think we know what you do. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. We know you're over there. There's a curtain. You're doing something. But I think you need to communicate that to us a little bit better. And Inez hit it right on the head. If we want to improve what we do in interpretation and history, we've got to hire the right people. And I could fill a room just like this with people I know with degrees in history who are excellent interpreters who have absolutely no shot in getting in this agency. And that's an absolute shame. The very fact that I'm here is a Christmas miracle. And I tell people that every single day. I think the report is an excellent report. And if you look at the findings at the end, if you look at the recommendations, a lot of times they're big things, creating national advisory councils. And what I'll tell you here today is what I think we need to do from the field level is we need to start in the parks. We need to start in Boston National Historical Park. We need to start at Antietam National Battlefield. And what that means is superintendents, site managers, supervisors, you need to give your interpretive rangers time to do the research. You need to make sure that they have access. You need to make sure they have access to the facilities that allow them to do that. For park historians who are producing these 100-page reports, historic resource reports, you need, and I think this is a great recommendation, you need to make some kind of deliverable to the interpretive staff so they can use that to develop themes, to develop universal statements, to identify tangibles. You need to do that. And if you're a field ranger, what you need to start doing is holding yourself to a higher standard. Because when you put on that badge and you put on that Stetson and you go out and you interact with the public, there's an expectation of what kind of information, what kind of interpretation they are going to get. And shame on any GS 579 Ranger who goes out there and forces the American people to lower their expectation of what they expect from the National Park Service. So we need to take some responsibility ourselves and not just leave it at this high up, big level in Washington or in the region. We need to start at home. Finally, partnerships, and I'll keep this pretty brief. Partnerships are, as we all know, vital. We need them, and they can be amazing. But I think we're so into that partnership mindset that a lot of parks, and I've seen this, and this is made apparent at the field level, we go out and we want to partner up with everybody we possibly can. And what we need to do is evaluate, really look at our partnerships, which ones are appropriate for us, which ones are valuing history and interpretation rather than devaluing it, because there are some partnerships out there that do that. And I think we need to take a scalpel through our partnerships, remove the ones we don't need, and get better ones and get new ones where it's going to help us fulfill our mission. And again, as we go on with this program today, I hope to offer you my perspectives, again, from that bleacher seat rather than from the luxury box. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Again, my name's Frank Barrows. I'm the Chief of Interpretation and Education at New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. If Chris represents the frontline bleacher seats, I represent kind of most of my career was in frontline, and I'm the new chief perspective in a small partnership park. And one of the findings that was in this report talks about smaller parks and that they often have combined interpretation and cultural resources management divisions, and by necessity, that fosters regular communication among park staff. And it says that's an arrangement that many survey respondents found more logical and functional. And on one hand, that might be true. We have our entire cultural resources division here, actually. I'm gonna embarrass our cultural resources division and ask them to stand. So Jan De Silva represents our cultural resource specialist, and although we eat lunch almost daily and we talk shop almost all the time and we work on projects together, there still can be a divide in smaller parks. And it might not be on the level of Air Force and Army, which I'm going to that game tomorrow, so in New York. So it might not be on that level, but we certainly have a divide when it comes to preparing our interpreters to be able to take a program wherever it needs to go. I see a lot of coaches from the coaching network out here this afternoon, and I'm sure you could all relate to being on programs where you've seen an interpreter who can take a canned program, present it great, be dramatic, be dynamic, but as soon as a visitor asks a question that takes them off course, that program can go downhill really fast. On the other hand, in New Bedford, we have some wonderful interpreters who also do living history, people who have been immersed in our stories for years, some of them 20 years. And it's amazing to watch that dance, to watch that symphony with visitors when somebody's so prepared and knows the context and can relate to things that were happening in the world and at the time, not only at the site, but being able to pull in the global and national stories to those specific sites. It's a really powerful thing. And one of the biggest challenges that we face, and I'm sure we're not alone, and a couple of the other panelists have touched on it already, is that a lot of times we have seasonals with no background in history or interpretation. You had what was it, a mechanic? Machine mechanic. We had a chef who rose to the top of our list somehow. So those are very real challenges, and how do we reach those interpreters? How do we get them to that level of those interpreters that can take a program wherever a visitor might take it spontaneously, when we, in a lot of cases, have 8 weeks, 2 weeks to train new people to learn a story and no time. A lot of times they're so regimented and scheduled that they don't have the time to do the research. If they did, do they even know how to conduct formal research? And that's another challenge that I think this report really speaks to. The last thing I'll say is if that's one of the challenges we face, we do have an example of something that I think worked really well among our interpreters and our cultural resources, and it was the project that Louis mentioned when he introduced me, the Communities of Whaling exhibit that focuses on African Americans and Azorians and West Indians and Native Americans and other ethnic groups involved in the whaling story. And rather than talk about the what of the exhibit, let's talk about why. What made that collaboration so successful? One, it was rooted in sound scholarship. It was rooted in an ethnographic study and studies that were conducted through the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom and oral histories. And all of those things, rather than sitting in archives or sitting on a shelf, were pulled in to create components of that exhibit. And the other thing is those layers of interpretation, so that the visitors have this introductory experience with the exhibit where they might be able to listen to an oral history from somebody who was in the whaling industry or a family member, or view photos that in some cases came from people's attics, not necessarily from museum collections, because we had such great community involvement in the program. And looking at a neighborhood where some of the wealthiest men lived side by side with fugitives and escaped slaves, and actually having visitors have that introductory experience and maybe be prompted to take a map and explore those neighborhoods where they're introduced to our partners. And partnerships is another thing that we're really stressing on this panel today. And it goes beyond collaborating with them on the exhibit. We want to facilitate those connections, and especially in a partnership park like New Bedford, where I always tell visitors, if you spend more than an hour in the visitor center, you probably spent too long, because the resources are out there in the park. These are the actual places and sites where the history happened. And these are the museums that own the collections and objects and artifacts that help us to tell this story. So facilitating those connections and hopefully prompting them to even want to go further down. And that's where we want to develop robust web content. And, you know, rather than the study sitting on the web or sitting on a shelf, there's this continuum that the visitor goes through from this introductory experience to the in-depth where they can really get into the meat of the story. And I'd be happy to talk more about the ins and outs of that exhibit, which involved not only the museum, the Whaling Museum, but also community members representing the different ethnic groups, the New Bedford Historical Society. We had a great partnership with UMass Dartmouth and utilizing an intern who created interactive elements to the exhibit for the online portion of the exhibit as well. So that's an example of something that I think we got right, but even in a small park, we still have the same challenges that many of the larger parks have, and I look forward to discussing those with all of you today.
Good afternoon. I'm Lou Ann Jones, and I'm at the Park History Program in Washington. And I'm so glad, Inez, that I'm not the person with the least amount of Park Service experience in the room today. I'm always will always be the newbie, I guess, in the Park Service. You know, yesterday earlier this week, I realized I've done a lot of labor history in the past 25 years, but I really am in a new place. I just came back from the Ranger Rendezvous in Southern California, where we were doing interviews with Park Service rangers, and actually very interesting interviews. But today I'm really here to talk about, when you say the word initiative, people can kind of roll their eyes, but what I hope will be a very promising initiative called the Historians Initiative. And it's part of a learning and development initiative coming out of Mather Training Center, and it's known as the Career Academies. And there will be a number of academies in natural resources and as well as cultural resources and other fields. but the Cultural Resources Academy will include museum management, cultural landscapes, historic preservation, and there are other people in this room that are involved with the whole Cultural Resources Academy movement. And what is envisioned is primarily online learning as part of this learning and development activity, and also some blended online and residential training. It was very fortuitous when the historians got together for a discussion as part of this Cultural Resources Academy. We got together in May of this year, and the OAH report had just come out the month before. So we were really able to use Imperial Promise as our model and as a way to help us structure our discussion. There were 16 historians who came together at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown for 3 very full days of discussion. Marla Miller, Ann Wisnett were there, able to join us, and Christina Rado and I were the Park Service leads. And so again, we took this as our, really as our model during the kickoff meeting. Among the questions that we discussed were what were the 2 or 3 key findings that people there thought were the most important for us to address, and perhaps not surprisingly, the interpretation and history divide was at the top of the list, and also issues of leadership at all levels of the Park Service rose to the top too. And we were concerned with how could learning and development help to address some of those concerns. We were also interested in who are our audiences and what are their needs. And certainly one of the key findings of the report is that people who practice history in the Park Service come from a whole variety of backgrounds and levels of preparation. So many people are history practitioners. We began to think about what are the key skills that a Park Service historian should have, what are the best ways that a Park Service historian should learn those skills, and again, what were the highest priorities for professional development. So what emerged out of that 3 days of very intense conversation were 3 courses that are in various stages of development now. And the first one of those we're calling Foundations of History courses, or Survivor's Guide to History in the National Park Service. And it's really aimed at people who are charged with doing historical work in the Park Service but have little, if any, formal history training to back them up, is something other people have mentioned here. And Marla Miller was one of our real guides in the development of that. So what we really envision is kind of a pyramid of courses that will start with the fundamentals of historic, what is history, use of primary, secondary sources, the kind of basics of historical research, and then build up the pyramid kind of like upper division courses, and then at the top, kind of a capstone course that would include a paper or some kind of museum exhibit or a product. And so as you can see, this could be very helpful in addressing that interpretation history divide, but also academic partnerships will probably be very central to developing a series of courses such as that. Then we envisioned another series of courses, history for NPS historians, and the key group there are people who come into the Park Service with training in history, even advanced training in history, but have very little understanding of what historians in the Park Service are called upon to do. So when people talk to us about historic resources studies and other kinds of studies, we're kind of clueless about what that means, and so we need to be brought up to speed on that. And then the final one would be history for Park Service managers, because as we've referenced today, it really takes people at the managerial level, giving people the time to do that kind of research, and supporting the kind of time, again, that it takes for people to do good interpretive programming and to do the kind of research that they need. So I'm very grateful to be here as part of this, as we are on the ground floor of this project, because I think it will be very helpful for people here to tell us how this might be helpful to people in the field, because that's definitely where it's intended to be of most help. And again, I would just say I think that this is probably the most robust conversation that has happened probably about Imperial Promise, and I hope that this is a model that people can take to other regions in the country, because I think it's really at that regional level that these kinds of conversations can really be quite meaningful. So I'm very grateful to be here today for any number of reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chris, I really liked your analogy of you down on the bleachers and some of us with our ties on in a luxury box perhaps. But
I meant that in a nice way.
but actually, when we developed this this program today, we really wanted to have the full breadth of experience. We wanted to have people who were working in the field, working directly with the public, as well as people in the regional office, as well as people representing Washington. So that's why I think this conversation is so exciting today, because it's not just top-down. And also, I think, Luann, you mentioned that it was historians that got together, but as I recall, the History Initiative also included folks involved in interpretation as well.
Yes, there were a number of people who have that as part of their experience, or some people who had that as part of their experience,
Right,
too.
okay.
Yes,
We were history practitioners regardless of series.
Yes,
So
yes.
experiences define that.
yes.
Okay, wait, actually, before the audience participates, I know, Christine, you're so excited, but we're filming this. We're filming this, so we need people to actually speak into a mic, and I think, is this the one that I'll pass around?
I have it back there.
You have, okay, great. If you want to come this way so you can see where people are raising their hands. So please wait until you get the mic. You don't have to face the camera, and you don't have to face the panel. You can face your colleagues that surround you. That's the whole idea. So would anybody like to open the conversation? Yes, in the back.
He doesn't really need the mic.
The people laughing are my colleagues who were expecting that I would be the first person to stand up and say something. But actually, there are a couple of things, and in response to what was said, certainly if Chris is in the bleacher seats as a GS5 permanent park guide, I'm one of those people, well, actually, an acting temporary non-competitive GS7 park guide. I'm one of the people underneath the bleachers who sneaked in without a ticket. But, of course, a few things. One, in terms of the divide, and it's been touched on, but I think for me, one of the things reading the report that struck me is part of that divide comes from both sides, from the academic historian and from the interpretive side. From the interpretive side, I've been in museum interpretation for 17 years now, something around there. And in the field, one thing that I've noticed, and it's addressed in the report, is that there tends to be an assumption that the primary form of interpretation, indeed the one that everyone starts with, is natural history, nature, in the National Association for Interpretation, in the Park Service, and that basically the only difference between natural history interpretation and social history interpretation is your content, that you can just plug in different things. And I want to ask the question, at least from my perspective, is that true, accurate, and appropriate? Or are there actually different skills, different techniques, and different abilities needed for history-based interpretation? The other side, I was once in academia, although for various reasons left it just before finishing my dissertation, is that very many academics appear in all fields to be most happy talking with each other and very suspicious of anything that can be understood by the general public. That is interpretation, or for those of you who are in the fields of public history, public history. So how do we overcome those two divides? And especially for those of us who don't have in-depth statistical training and don't understand what those little sideways horseshoes and everything else mean, how do we get the interpretation for us that we can then interpret to the public? And then the second thing, just comment that because I came first from a non-Park Service historical site where I did work with a rather good, if slightly intimidating, occasionally historian as my boss, and where we also had about 1,000 linear feet of site-specific archives on site to research in and create entirely new programs. to a small national park site that had both a curator and a person, at least one of whose job duties was to be the park historian. She had other things as well, with whom we were able to work directly to Boston National Historical Park, where, and this is no criticism of Dr. Blatt, whose conversations I enjoy and value immensely, but where, because it's a cultural resources management, and because there's a huge amount of responsibility and time involved in that, getting connections to that part of the park, getting on hand the kind of primary source material and archival material that could go a long ways into making our site-specific interpretation better, is very, very difficult, simply because of the divided responsibilities. And in terms of what Inez said, in terms of what everyone on the panel said, is there a way that we can overcome that and make these resources more available and direction more available to people who are frontline interpreters? So that's what the report and the people speaking provoked in me. Anyway, thank you.
Would anybody like to respond? And I include people in the audience, or comment on or extend the conversation. Well, as people, oh, yeah, please, Christine.
So just a sort of brief response about usable history, which I think you were pointing to. I don't think that the divide is that bald. Public history, I mean, there are viable public history programs and plenty of people in the Park Service who practice public history. And I don't want to take up a whole lot of time because I am one of those historians who's stepping out from behind the curtain, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But we have a host of reports, which the OEH, I think, has turned a thumbs down on. But these reports that we do for cultural resource management are supposed to be applied history. They should be eminently readable. As part of the panel that we'll talk about a little bit later about whether or not that's happening. But I think that I think there's a little bit of a divide about what historians are thinking are happening and what producing, and the feedback we're giving to interpreters, which we feel falls on deaf ears. If you want to talk about frustration about all the times we've been asked to review things or to give our comments or to offer our help, and people say, no, you don't know what you're talking about, it's a little bit insulting. So I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what are useful products and to really have, I think, a reckoning, almost a come to Jesus moment about really what's happening in the agency.
Anybody else on that point? I would just like to add that Boston Park had a really interesting collaboration a number of years ago with the academic historian Al Young, who is very much a historian of social history and became very, very engaged and involved with Boston National Historical Park and with the Rangers, and talked extensively about how he gained a lot of information from the expertise that they had. And in fact, they contributed directly to the work that he was doing on the history of Boston in the Revolution. So what it seems to me is that there are definitely academics out there who talk to each other, and there always will be. And to some extent, a lot of this is driven by personality. And I think that's one of the larger issues that needs to be addressed in some way. I don't have the answers for this, but I find that in the Park Service, you can work well with certain individuals, but you have to seek them out, and you have to know who they are. But it's not an organizational structure that lends itself to collaboration. And I don't know how you change that, but it seems to me it's one of the keys to making a difference. Wait for the mic. I know you have a loud voice, but.
Thank you, Louis. My name's Chuck Arning. I'm a ranger with the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And I have a couple of things I do want to talk a little bit about today because I think a couple of things have been touched on. One of which, I don't know if there's a personality problem as much as there's a structural problem. We do not have a cultural person. We do not have a historian. We had a historian in '95. And management since '95 has chosen not to use that position, and therefore now it has gone away. And I think that's instructive because that leaves the Rangers to do all the work. I wish I had someone I could throw stuff to. Fortunately, Marty has always been really good, and I can call him up and say, what do you think about this? So there are people within the resources that we can utilize to assist us. So the structural problem is what is the most important thing for rangers to have as a resource for them and sites to have? And I think that we've always undervalued the role of the historian. And on top of that, we've made it a paper-pushing world where you have all these reports. We have a planner who does our 106 type stuff. And I think that might be more of an appropriate place for them to do. The other thing I want to point out very quickly is the value of partnerships. And we know, I work in the Blackstone Valley, so you got Providence to Worcester. So we have a lot of colleges and universities. And most of the scholars I'm aware of are more than willing to work with us in all kinds of ways. Whether it's be on our television program or to join us for a conference, they're more than willing for me to pick up the phone and call them. So the partnerships are really there. I think the issue is, and sometimes it's a real time constraint, you have to go out and make those calls and make those connections. And I think that's part of the innovative part of working in a partnership park, that Frank and I both have that opportunity. The other thing is, and I'll point out today that I brought one of our partners here, Jim Moran, who's Director of Public Outreach at the American Antiquarian Society. Antiquarian Society's got over 4 million pieces of America printed material from 1640 to 1877. And for anybody who has any stories that fall into that, you need to meet this gentleman. And on top of that, because part of what we've done here with the I&E group in the Granite Cluster is we have put together workshops every 3 or 4 months, and sometimes you get further away because everybody gets real busy. But we had one on climate change, and Louis, you were a part of that. And one of the members of the panel was a young lady from the Antiquarian Society who had slides and broadsides and images that talked about interpreting climate change at historic sites. It got everybody very excited about the fact that, wow, here is a resource we could really use. So I went back to Jim and his colleagues there at the Antiquarian Society, and they've set up a workshop on December 13th of this year for the first 25 people who sign up through me to come to the Antiquarian Society to learn about their research, but also what are the needs of the interpreters, the curators, and historians. I'm not so sure there's this huge divide. I think it may be more of our mind, but I do think it's a structural issue within management of how we break parks up. And I have, going to, and here's the other thing that I'll finally, before I be quiet here, allowing rangers to attend conferences like NCPH and OEH and the Environmental Historians Conferences and places like that, labor conferences, are really, really important. And we don't structure time, we don't structure budgets. We always say, well, where do you want to do? I'd like to do that. Well, there's no money in the budget. That's great. We can't travel there. It's in Santa Fe. Oh, my God. So the point is, my friends, we need to push that issue with management. You can't keep cutting people to the bone if you don't give them opportunity to expand themselves. And every time we go, and this is not just a Park Service issue. It's in with a lot of the partners we have in the world of public history. Don't have budgets, don't send their staff out, and you pay on your own dime if you want to promote your own career. So the point is, Jim and I are going to be here. We have some information on this conference we're putting together. And if it works well, we can have many, many ones. But the resources are here. And the benefit of it is that Jim and the curators can pull out anything you want from Minuteman or Adams or any of the others, Salem and other places that kind of fit in that 1640 to 1877, which is most of our parks to some degree. So anyhow, we look forward to chatting you later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Yes, over there. Yeah, please stand up so she can see you. Thanks.
Louis, I make a suggestion that you ask the speakers to say who they are.
Oh,
Who they're affiliated with.
sure. Chuck, thank you. Yeah, if you could please say your name and your
I'm
affiliation.
Sarah Olson. I'm both a park superintendent and I'm currently working in the regional cultural resource programs. So I'm really excited about the action plan that you are going to produce as a result of this conference. But I would just urge you in doing that to recognize that it's I think the Park Service, just in the Northeast region, it's a very complex world of different kinds of both cultural resource and interpretive responsibilities. And I would urge the action plan to be quite specific on perhaps starting with who the stakeholders are, from the park perspective, from the regional program perspective, from the interpretive perspective, from the historian's perspective, from the compliance perspective, and try to give us the most helpful, I think the most help you could provide would be specific recommendations on not just what the future should look like, but who can make what change from where. I'll end with that.
My name's Jocelyn Gould. I'm from Boston National Historical Park. And going back to Chuck's point and to a point that Inez made, we have a lot of great conferences and education programs. The Granite Subcluster does all the really cool things. But a lot of the people who get sent are not frontline interpreters. And then they go back to their parks and they're unable to tell everybody what they learned. It would be really helpful if the 5s, the 7s, the frontline people, the seasonals, got sent to these things so that they could experience what was going on and then come back and let all the frontline people actually have an hour to actually stand and sit together and talk. Because we've done some great things at our park, and it's only because all the 5s are together and we sit together in the winter and do projects together that we're able to really get our education pushed forward, because it's great that the 9s and the 11s and everybody get to go to all these great conferences, but it's not really great if you're a 5, because you don't get to go and make all these connections and all this networking and get all this information. And there's kind of a logjam, it seems like, between the non-frontline and the frontline people. And I think that if we actually talked to each other more, had division meetings before, like we've been trying to, before we open our sites, or open our sites an hour or two later, and actually just sit around a table with some donuts and coffee and talk with each other, you actually get some really awesome ideas that emerge out of that really make everybody really excited. So I think that's something that people have to focus a little bit more on. Work on your base, because I just came from fundamentals. They kept telling me that I am the future, and I can't really be the future if I don't have the information. So that's my suggestion.
Actually, before we continue, I wanted to just address that point, which I think is really important, and it comes back to a point that several others have made, that there needs to be some kind of way of structuring time, allowing time and budgets to do a variety of these activities, whether it be allowing rangers at whatever level to participate in conferences, or structure time and budgets to bring people together across the divide. Anyway, there were some other people that wanted to follow up. Cash? Oh, I'm sorry. You had the microphone. I'm sorry. Sorry, I didn't realize somebody had the microphone. Gotcha. Please.
Hello, my name's Erin. I'm from Boston National Historical Park. As a GS5, I'm not even really in the stadium most of the time. I'm outside selling hot dogs. But I do have one thing. This issue with collaboration, is this a structural or is it a personality issue? And something that I've noticed from being on the totem pole and just kind of starting out, I have been in the Park Service for about 6 years, but we are our own issue. Our structure is made up of these personalities. Our personalities are our own problems. We've created these issues. We're the ones that need to fix them. We need to step around our own egos a lot of the time. If the personality issue is because information isn't coming from the top down or it's not going from the bottom up, it's because of us. And I think the only way to fix that is by doing something like this. I don't think I've ever seen so many park people in one room in my entire time here. And I think that's wonderful. And I think it is going to have to be small steps. And I do think, as Inez says, in order to be agents of change, we need to get out of our own way and push this and stop trying to place the blame, but rather take the responsibility to make a difference, to keep this going. Because at the end of the day, this is about our visitors. Because if they don't show up to the park, none of us have a job, okay? So that really needs to be the front line, that we here for preservation, conservation, interpretation, education, you name it, it'll have a shun at the end of it. But we can't do any of that without our visitors. So at the end of the day, that's really what we need to be keeping in mind here. And I just want to say, yay us for doing that today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cassius Cash, Superintendent of Boston National Historical Park and Boston African American National Historic Site. So just to round out the luxury box view of things, to stay in that theme there, I think, you know, to historians and interpreters, I share a statement with my staff when we get into that rut and trying to solve something. I talk about how do you participate in your own rescue. And the analogy that I give is if I throw you out of a raft and we're going on a class 4 rapid, what's the first thing you're going to do? After you scream, you're going to try to get to the side. You're going to participate in your own rescue. And I can tell you, coming from the U.S. Forest Service, there are a lot of us incoming superintendents don't have this backdrop. And so we talk about partnerships externally. I think we need to make sure that we don't overlook internally, too, to make sure that you can connect the dots to why historians are important and how that feeds into the visitor experience in that piece. So there are some conversations that I think we're overlooking internally. And I'm not saying that's the reason why the historian position wasn't filled, but I'm saying also that that conversation won't hurt as we have a new round and new backgrounds of superintendents coming in. And so it's easy to say, so my next point is easy to say we need to have time to do this, but we have a public, a local public, that expectations don't change. They still expect for Monkey Hill Museum to open at whatever time. We still have an expectation from folks at Faneuil Hall that the visitor center is going to. So there's a conversation that folks like myself, I'm prepared to have, but just know it's not like a click your heel 3 times and we just make that time on that piece. And so superintendents, we have those conversations about those are the new type of conversations. How do we morph the expectations of our local public to say that it's something you're not losing? In essence, it's something you gain because our interpreters that are coming out there don't even be of a higher quality. And so we need to have your help in developing those sound bites of how that's digestible on the public's ear to make that time for folks to have that quality time to talk with historians and so forth.
Yeah. And then Liza. No, go ahead. You, yeah.
Are you sure you want to do this?
2 minutes.
I'm Jim Hollister, Minuteman National Historical Park. I think one of the things that we can do to help ourselves, interpreters, like, you know, when somebody asks me to describe my job, I'm an interpreter. I don't claim to be an historian, even though I'm very familiar with the subject matter at my park. I'm familiar with the primary and secondary sources. I stay up to date with current scholarship. I'm not a historian. I'm an interpreter. But that's not to downplay what I do. I think what we need to do with our interpretive staff, our frontline staff, is to acknowledge the historians within them, to acknowledge that they have to utilize skills as historians, to be familiar with those sources. You know, one of the things we've done at Minuteman, we have a program called Who Shot First. And it's a tour of the Northbridge battlefield where we actually hand sources to the visitors. And they read them, and the ranger becomes therefore a facilitator and facilitates a discussion amongst the visitors. So we're putting history into their hands. But what I've also noticed is among our staff, that one program has improved many other programs because now we're looking at sources and being able to quote, firsthand accounts, people who were there. So it gives us a little bit more gravitas. You know, what's the difference between a tour guide and a park ranger? You know, we don't script our park rangers. They're expected, we give them the subjects, like if we're going to give a talk about the Minutemen, well, that's what we're going to be talking about, but we don't script them. We don't say, this is what you're going to say. You know, they're responsible for coming up with their own content. We give them direction, we give them access to sources, but they have to come up with it on their own. So the difference, of course, between a tour guide and a park ranger is a park ranger can quote their sources, can cite their sources. They know what they're talking about. They can take the interpretation in different directions. So we all have to play the part of historian. And to your point, Chris, about feeling that weight of responsibility, as a park ranger, when you put on that uniform and you wear that Stetson. I remember the first time that I was stationed down at the North Bridge in Park Service uniform. And it's like, oh my goodness, people are going to look to me and they're going to expect me to know stuff. 10 years later, I still feel that, and just a little slight bit of panic, before going into a tour, and I've been at this for ages. So it is an awesome responsibility. So again, we need to look at ourselves as historians, but that takes time.
I'm Liza Stearns, education specialist for Olmsted, Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, and Kennedy National Historic Site. I have a lot of things on my mind. I'm not going to try to get them all. I wanted to comment on Luann and what you offered up in terms of the Cultural Resources Academy. I think this is a critical alternative delivery system for interpreters to make use of. If this conversation that's putting together the Academy with Cultural Resources can put together a series of rubrics that allow people in the field, on the ground, to begin to figure out how to assess primary source material for its value, to criteria select secondary source material for its value relevant to the resource, that will be incredibly critical. That's one sort of thought. Another idea with respect to the Academy is thinking about the role of management in ensuring that field interpretation is done well, makes wise use of new empirical data coming down the pipeline from historians. And I'm bringing this up because what happens when you get to the field level with new empirical data is that you are faced with the visitor who's coming in not to hear that new empirical data, but to hear the feel-good data that they know from the book they read in 1962. And that is to not make light of the public. People come for a variety of different reasons, but on the ground we are dealing with how do you then begin to transition a story, begin to engage in dialogue with people when people may not be looking for that? So for the historians involved in the Academy to begin to think about what does history look like when it's translated into the public process that engages other people in the dialogue. It's not always easy on the ground. With respect to the wonderful cultural resources reports, historic resource studies, et cetera, that come down, I really do think working to make those digestible to the field and be thoughtful in the presentation, both in terms of the Academy behind it, but also how it's apt to be digested by the public, so that there might be a rubric for looking about this new finding, how might that be perceived by the public? What might you do to facilitate a positive dialogue as opposed to a disaster on the ground? And along line with that conversation, what's management going to be doing to have the back of the field interpreter that's changing the interpretive message based on new empirical findings that are coming down the pipe? Hope that made sense.
Thanks. Would anybody on the panel like to comment? Luann, do you have any further comments?
I think that that's a very helpful comment to make at this point, and certainly there are people just in the kind of sub-team that I'm working on that has much more field experience, frontline experience than I do, that are able to think about what does somebody on the ground really need out of what we're trying to produce here. And I think it's a real challenge, but I think, again, this is a very helpful conversation to have at this point in the development process, so we'll absolutely do the best we can. Thank you.
And I think actually what's interesting about this conversation right now is that, Jim Hollister, you brought up a really interesting point about interpreters acting as historians in the field, as storytellers, and which is a critical role that they play. And as I talked earlier about Al Young, the historian, academic historian who understood the larger context and the many different contexts of the American Revolution, coming to Boston Park, and the Rangers knowing their particular stories very well. But there is a need to join those two. That is to say that you need to put the stories that you know of your particular site into the larger context. And that's actually, people study for many years on these topics. It's not that easy to incorporate right away into your programs. So the trick, it seems to me, is to be able to bring those two together, whether it be a historian in a park. Now, how many parks in the Northeast region actually have so-called historians? I mean, there are very few left anymore. When I started with the Park Service in the early 90s, there were many more. There are very few, and I see that this is a serious structural issue as well. The historians we do have are doing the Section 106, the compliance issues, but we really don't even have that many doing it in the field. Was there another comment from the panel on this discussion? No, anybody else out? Yes, Christine?
So I want to riff on what Cash said about participating in your own rescue. What I told, I'm a supervisor, or was a supervisory historian, what I tell my staff is there's a lot of greener grass. And by saying that, well, most people think things are better somewhere else, in another grade series, another grade level, another series. And I think I just want to offer as an observation, how many 0170s do we have in the room? Four, five. 0170 is a professional historian series. And today was billed as a critical conversation looking at the history interp divide. And sitting where I am, most of what we've heard about is interp. And so thinking about what the historians do, what we could do, and how maybe you could advocate for us as well in a real partnership. Just sort of putting that out there. Obviously, there's a lot of work we need to do to build bridges to talk to one another, but it's been a conversation that's been wholly, I think, focusing on the needs of the field. And one of the things that Louis brought up is what historians can bring for you, particularly at a service-wide level or at a regional level, is that perspective. You know your park's history very, very well. There are academics in the field who know the broader context, but often on the regional level, there are historians who know a lot of parks who can start to knit that together. And I think it is a structural issue as well as a personality issue, how we can work as an action item to start to institutionalize those kinds of conversations with respect and understanding of what each other's series or positions or grade levels are going through. The reality is we're not going to be hiring a whole lot more people, but how we can leverage, that's a favorite word right now, what we have to make these conversations happen, but also to really create quality work and programs.
Hello, my name is Garrett Clower. I'm a park ranger at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, National Historic Site. When this report came out, in many ways, I almost felt like it was written to me. I don't know if anybody else felt that way, because my background through schooling, went to grad school for history. I had no idea that you could even be a park ranger. Didn't know it even existed. Fell into it completely accidentally. I became an SCA and came out to Minuteman and worked with Jim right after I got out. And I realized that a lot of us have talked about divide between academic historians, public historians, and so forth. And I think that academic historians can talk to the public very easily. I feel like I do it all the time. And I feel like we don't believe enough in our public that our public can understand us. It's our job to talk to them in ways, not necessarily highly technical terms. The old joke was in Philadelphia before I came up here that I was the only one that I gave the anti-papist tour of Independence Hall because I would talk about the Quebec Act in my Independence Hall tour. And they all said, no one's going to understand what you're talking about. But they did, and they really enjoyed it, I think. And that I think there's a lot of people like me that are in the GS9 series that level that are out there that do have strong historical backgrounds and that we do the work of historians for ourselves. Now, I think the problem is, and all of these wonderful recommendations in the report are great things to look at in the future about adding more historians and these big structural changes, but we all know that we have limited resources, and I think the most important thing we can do in the short term is to have a cultural change in the Park Service that recognizes the importance of academic level history in the interpretive field. And we see so much focus on, and not that these are bad things, but on curriculum-based education, on IDP programs and EPLI programs which talk about interpretive techniques, but they, in my opinion, implicitly minimize the importance of subject area expertise. And so I'd like to see the Park Service value, and this is probably a little bit selfish, I'd like to see them value people with my background, with background in academic history, and recognize that it is important. And instead of just telling a good story that people want to hear and to have people come to our parks, or telling them a simple story that, you know, because they're regular people and won't understand anything more, that we can bring these academic elements into our story. In fact, I know a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of my coworkers that are here in the field have done, you know, stayed up till midnight the night before a tour to make sure we had all of that documentation in our program that we wanted to. We do it on our own, and we do it on our own time because, you know, for obvious reasons. But I think that, you know, the first thing we need to do is recognize as an agency that that is important. And then quickly, I want to point out agree with Chris on one other thing that he talked about with partnerships. And my previous stop was Philadelphia at Independence. And I think Independence is often seen as a case study in the Park Service of how not to do partnerships, because we really surrendered far too much power in many cases to people who don't have the same interest as we do. And I think that that's very important, that when we do partnerships, like Chris said, one of the things in the report that they talked about, and to me came off as being self-congratulatory on part of one of the participants in creating the report, was talking, at least to me, was talking about the President's House exhibit that has been created in Philadelphia, which, at least in my opinion, is a terrible piece of history that was co-opted by a group for political reasons and tells a part of a story, which is a very important part of the story, but neglects a far greater context, like we were talking about. So I just think Chris is very much correct that we need to pick partners with similar goals, at least, as our own.
Thank you. Jim?
Hello, I'm Jim McKay. I'm a Chief Ranger out at Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. Just a couple of observations. I think that the historians in the Park Service have to do, that you have to continue to do the job of selling yourself. That's a big deal. I've been in the Park Service for over 30 years, and it was for much of that, I had very little sense of what historians did or what they did in the Park Service, you know, the professional historians in the Park Service. Second point I wanted to make is that in order to improve the situation for all of us vis-a-vis history, is somehow there has to be something in it for the superintendents. There's got to be something that they have to be organizationally, I mean, they have to be held to that. You know, if it were, something like, you know, how many widgets do you have in your staff, or do you have all your widgets in place? You know, they can answer that. You know, rolls up to some database someplace like what is the not GIPRA. Well, FBMS. Yeah, pick one. You guys get my point. It has to be part of something that rolls up to a report to a database someplace that has an element of history in it. And if the superintendent doesn't have it, he gets a black mark. He or she gets a black mark. And if that's the case, then history is suddenly going to be important. The third thing I just wanted to say is, and this goes to Inez's point, is we would solve a lot of our problems that we're discussing here, both on the history side and on the interpretive side, if a person with an MA in history if we have a positive degree requirement for being an interpreter in the Park Service. I mean, it's silly that we don't. All of you people have put a lot of time and effort into doing your jobs, and you all have academic backgrounds, and in order to get that job in the first place, it should be a degree requirement. And if it's a history degree, to be a park ranger interpreter at a historic site, that kind of makes sense, and that would solve a lot of our problems.
Thanks, Jim.
Hi, I'm Melinda Jetty. I teach history and run an undergraduate public history program up at Franklin Pierce University in New Hampshire. So I actually have a question about the idea of action items, and this is a question for the the moderator and for the panelists and all of you working perhaps on action items. Is there a place, or would it be necessary, would it be useful to have those of us who are more in the academic side but also work on public history to be in the action items? Is that something that's a good idea? Would that be important? What would it look like? And would these action items be like a Northwest regional, or how would it look? The reason I'm thinking about this, because we're going to be going into program review next year for my program, History and Public History Together. So my higher-ups are going to want to know, why should we keep this public history program? What does it do? And then ethically, I think it's really important. The students who are spending all this money going to school, I think ethically we have to be focused on helping them get employment and doing valuable work, and they're paid for it.
So let me just clarify. So when you mean by being in the action plan,
yeah,
that partnerships with universities and colleges such as yours would be part of the recommendations?
Yeah, should it be an action item? And when you have an action item, you have to have a follow-up, and it has to show that it's been done and how it worked out and who did what and all that, you know.
Yes. Well, first of all, that was one of the major recommendations in the report itself. Not that all of those recommendations are feasible, frankly, but it certainly was an important one, and it does tie into the issue of partnerships. I have to say that I took a chance by throwing out the action plan idea today, because I no longer work for the National Park Service. Right? Sure, let's have an action plan. Right. But actually, I think it's really true, and the reason I threw it out is because I don't want this to stop here, because I've seen too many times when it does stop after a gathering. Although I have to say, I'm really impressed by the turnout today and the quality of discussion. I think this is really exciting. Why did I leave? But I think that we're going to be, at the end of the two sessions today, we're going to be having a brief wrap-up where we're going to be identifying key things to follow up on. What form that will actually take, I can't tell you, because I no longer work with the agency. But I think that the planning group will get together again to sort of put together the recommendations that we think make sense from the report, as well as additional recommendations or ideas that come out of this meeting to move them forward. How that will happen, I don't know yet. Maybe there are others in the room who could answer that question. Chuck Smythe has an answer. Oh, no? Oh, comment. Chuck.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to commend Louis and Marty and the members of the history department at UMB for this session. I think this is very exciting and interesting. Yeah? Who else?
Say who you are and where you're from.
That's my rule. My name is Chuck Smythe. I'm the anthropologist, the cultural anthropologist for the Northeast region here. And first of all, I've never been in the company of so many interpreters, so I find it very interesting. In my 12 years for the Park Service, I've been invited to one LRIP meeting, participate in one LRIP, and I really think that that was a good experience. I think there should be a lot more of a regional staff involved in LRIPs and parks that might help make a difference. One comment I have is for if there are any action items or follow-up, that there be a little bit of reflexivity made part of that, so that this issue, I think, is broader than just that between historians and interpreters. And clearly I feel the same way as an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and you know, you heard about the experience at New Bedford, and the idea of this is relating to, you know, looking at what you mean by history, and what is history for the Park Service. Is it history with a capital H, or is it, and do we want to make interpreters little historians, or is history more about heritage and more about people's history that belong to people, and that different peoples have different perspectives on their history, and so it's really a matter of complexity and of different perspectives on what history is, depending on where you're coming from. And I think that would go a long way to do that. And then the other little point I wanted to make is It just went out of my mind, but it had to do with sort of looking at this as the tip of the iceberg. And I think a dialogue between interpreters and historians is a great start for thinking about improving interpretation and reviewing interpretation. But if we extend that out, Christine and I are involved with consulting with Indian tribes, and we've consulted with about 50 Indian tribes on the history of the War of 1812 and what that means to them today. And we found that there's really no mechanism for tribal review of existing content on the webs, either like for the Civil War website or this website for the War of 1812 we want to develop. So I would encourage an action item to think about how there can be review by interested groups, particularly those whose history you're interpreting, of the materials that are presented in parks on that. How can a review take place? And a mechanism for that would really be a good, useful action item that would engage a diversity of groups and would be very helpful. I'm not speaking against what Inez was talking about and speaking with Marty about this, but I'm just suggesting that that's a good start, but that's just the tip of the pyramid.
Thanks, Chuck. Just one comment. A mechanism for review, that came up many times while I was the chief historian for the region. Is there any mechanism in place, and it turns out there's not, when publications are put forward, wherever they're coming from within the agency, there's no mechanism for having review done by the historians. And I think that it's something that needs to be addressed at all levels. Just one thing that you did say too about history improving interpretation. I think it's actually a two-way street. I think that history can bring a lot to the table for interpretation, but what interpretation, it seems to be, brings to the table is knowing the audience. And in spite of what the gentleman said about the Quebec Act, and I agree with that, I think that you can make anything accessible, but we also need to know where our audiences are coming from to help them further learn and engage with the historic sites that we share with them. So I think it definitely is a two-way street. Yeah, Jim.
Jim Shea, and former MPS employee, former museum curator and site manager of the Longfellow House, Washington headquarters, and JFK birthplace. What I have not heard about is the great divide between museum curators, historians, interpreters. Being a curator for many, many years is great treasures at all our parks. And often I was a very proactive curator, trying to work with interpretation, education, and not saying my recent job was like that, but other parks I worked at was very difficult to make that merge and working together. So I would encourage I&E and historians to reach out and seek out the curators and all these terrific archives and collections that are in all our parks, whatever park you're from. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Jim.
Hi, I'm Jan De Silva, and I'm the Cultural Resource Specialist at New Bedford-Whaley National Historical Park. And just to mention, I'm also the facility manager. So historians wear a lot of different hats, not just the history hat. And I just want to follow up on what Chuck Smythe said, who I've worked with a lot on ethnohistories in New Bedford. And one of the recommendations was to encourage diversity in the Park Service and encourage more ethnic groups to participate in the historian field. And one thing I noticed was the fact that they want to have a history advisory committee, but all the groups that were mentioned, they didn't include one single ethnic history organization like the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I know there were other ethnic history organizations that could be tapped. And if you don't kind of reach out to those groups, you're never going to be able to make the field more diverse. And I just wanted to point that out as an action item.
Thanks, Jen.
Hi, my name is Ellen Anstey. I work at the Songus Industrial History Center, which is a partnership between Lowell National Historical Park and the University of Massachusetts Lowell. So talk about partnerships, that's a great one. I'm also a student in the public history program here at UMass Boston. And that's why I wanted to say, put in a plug for the students. I read the report and there's an action item in there about creating lists of projects that you can have students do. When I first read Jim Green's description of the public history program, it was working with classroom teachers, working with museums, working with national parks, and I was like, wow, this is all my worlds coming together in one program. So in this program, it's been great. We've been using primary sources. We've been meeting. I've met a lot of people in this room through this program. So I just wanted to put in a plug for the students. Have your projects ready. One of the things I have to do is an internship. And I'm struggling because there's so many choices in Massachusetts of where I'd like to go. Should I stay in Lowell? Should I go somewhere else? You know, so just have your projects ready. There's students out there just itching for projects. Just want to say that.
Thank you. Before we keep going, I want to ask if there's anybody on the panel. We have about 8 minutes left for this session, and I want to make sure that we close on time to get a break before the next session. So I'm going to ask if there's any comments from the panel.
Is this on? Okay, everybody hear me?
Yeah.
I did want to mention and address the public history students because, I mean, I was a public history student not that long ago, and I feel like we don't, as an agency, take advantage enough of public history interns, and I think we need to get them, you know, into our system a little bit better. What that also does, though, is gives them hope, and people can do a lot of things on hope. Now, we also mentioned a degree requirement to be a interpreter, GS9 interpreter, or historian? Cross-field, okay. You know, I think when we hire people, what we got to do is we don't need to hire a GS level, we don't need to hire a degree, we need to hire people. But that being said, what that degree requirement does is it helps to limit that field a little bit. So that means we're not getting the you know, culinary, you know, sandwich artists from Subway at the top of that list. We're getting public history students, maybe, that get to the top of that list. And I think it's the value of a degree requirement.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. Being an interpreter, one of the things in the study says, you know, that interp leans more heavily towards emotional connections, whereas history is more about intellectual connections, and that's pretty much true with me. I'm a sucker. I'm a sucker for emotional connections. We actually have a tear jar at New Bedford Whaling where we collect tears from visitors. So I think that's one thing is we don't often speak the same language, and I'm fortunate enough that our cultural resources specialist leans more heavily towards interp than I lean towards history. And that's been really helpful in terms of incorporating our cultural resources into history. How we can do that more, I see happening in little pockets. I mean, the great thing about the Northeast region is that there's so many historic sites in close proximity to each other. Some of the best meetings I've been to are with our new chiefs group that we don't have cameras there, so we're a little less censored when we talk. But things like Chuck is organizing, trying to get the Granite subcluster to visit the Antiquarian Society, which I've been there. It's an excellent resource. And thinking about, selfishly, what I mentioned in my opening comments, the need to teach our interpreters how to do research, how to learn that history, what are the resources. I think it would be helpful if we could do more collective training, not just in the times when it's convenient for us, but also when it's convenient for when all of our employees come in, which for most of us, not all of us, but for most of us it's April, June, leading up to July and August. So that's one thing that I could use as a chief, as an interpreter. My question kind of goes back to Christine, is there's only 5 historians here today, is what can interp do for you?
was just going to say, I mean, this is very encouraging as we talk about this career academy, and to realize that there really can, that we can really serve this purpose, and there is envisioned again this online commons, and I don't understand the technology, whatever, that can create these communities, but I'm assured that there are ways that people can get together, and we can accommodate very diverse and challenging schedules for people on the ground. So thank you very much for.
Mine doesn't seem quite so profound, because what I keep going through my head is if we want different results, then we have to have different schedules. We have to change the way we do business. It's really pure and simple. It seems so obvious to me, but Cash keeps reminding me this is a marathon, not a sprint, and it might take 3 years to go through the mechanism of changing that core infrastructure so that we could set up these work teams who have the time to do the real work. It's not easy, but we're going to do it, plain and simple. He gave me the thumbs up. We're going to do it.
This is great when you have your boss right in front of you and he gives you the thumbs up. I like that. As opposed to that, yeah. So, yeah, there were a couple more. Yes, right here.
I appreciate the necessity for a degree. Here I am, UMass Boston, Public History Department. But I would also like to put in a plug for those of us who have been in the field for 18, 20 years, who have the experience as public interpreters and educators, who've done the curriculum, which can be intellectually and content rich, who've done interpretation wearing multiple hats. Please, Jane, don't get really mad at me or Jim, but an MA does not passion make.
Hi, I'm David Blackburn, Chief of Cultural Resources from Lowell National Historic Park. We've been talking a lot about education, and one of the things that I find really unfortunate is we can look to resolve two sides of the same coin in terms of getting historians in our parks, and that's what frustrates me is the fact that our agency, and as far as I know, the Department of Interior, has no standardized criteria for staff working and going and getting professional degrees. It's park by park, superintendent by superintendent. I've been with the agency for 25 years, and I've seen folks who've gone to get bachelor's degrees and master's degrees where they've had to take leave without pay. They've had to use all of their vacation time, and I personally think that's criminal. And I would love to see whether it's fomented superintendent to superintendent or within the Northeast region some kind of unified policy that provides everyone an equal chance to follow their dreams of enrichment, their dreams of career advancement by going into college degrees. Also, I was with Chuck, technically my background is anthropology, but we're all looking at our resources and our world through the lens of people and culture. Although we're talking a lot about history, I really see this as multidisciplinary. And I've talked to Inez a little bit about this and others, and one of the things that disturbs me, I've had the pleasure of going to the American Association of Museums national meeting. It is the advocacy group in North America for museums. 5,000 people, less than 0.1% of the attendees work for the National Park Service. At times, we've become so robust and so good at talking amongst ourselves that we culturally exclude the opportunities to make bridges to best practices, to other organizations where we can say, how have you built this wheel, rather than trying to invent it ourselves. 2013 AAM is in Baltimore. Put in on that spreadsheet 15 or more people, which I think is also an asinine, this whole thing with travel, that as a federal agency, we have to live to the standards of GSA and the Secret Service, but that's for another discussion.
Thank you, David. I think that's actually, we've run out of time. That's a nice way to end. challenging the GSA. If everybody could take a break, be back here in 15 minutes, and we'll start the second session. Thanks very much.